The Sugar Research Foundation, or the SRF, was formed in 1943 in the midst of the Second World War by members of the sugar industry. The SRF was comprised mostly of large corporations and conglomerates of the sugar industry. The SRF's purpose, and I quote, was dedicated to the scientific study of sugar's role in food and communication of that role to the public during a period of wartime sugar rationing. But as we already know, bureaucracy is a machine that keeps growing exponentially. By the end of World War II, 77 firms and corporations, presumably led by the global elite, were actively involved in the SRF. While the foundation funded some scientific research, their mission statement was, and still is, to convey the value of sugar as a food staple and industry to the public using accurate and pertinent information. These were going to be completely unbiased, rigorously reviewed pieces of evidence, right? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that there would be conflicts of interest in the research of the products that they sell. These conflicts of interest came to light in 2016, but it was too late as sugar had already become a staple in modern food. The Journal of the American Medical Association, one of the top sources of scientific literature, got its hands on internal industry documents from the SRF, including corporate conversations and instructions that the foundation gave to the scientists it worked with. They also looked at the evidence that was used to create the dietary recommendations of several government health organizations. 3 researchers used the documents to tell us a chronological story of special interest corruption on behalf of the SRF. The paper made very few headlines, so most people have no idea about it. Therefore, I'm going to summarize the findings from the paper, which you can find linked in the description below. The story begins in the 1950s. Coronary heart disease was at an all-time high, and scientists began researching dietary factors for possible causes. By the 1960s, 2 major camps evolved that argued the main cause of heart disease. One hypothesis was built on the work of prominent British physiologist John Yudkin, who claimed that added sugar was the culprit. On the other hand, an American physiologist named Ancel Keys claimed that total fat and saturated fat were the main causes. One of these 2 theories would end up shaping nutrition science as we know it today. Clearly, the SRF needed to protect the interests of its shareholders. The SRF's president, Henry Haas, closely observed the debate. He gave a speech in 1954 to the American Society of Sugar Beet Technologists, saying, "Leading nutritionists are pointing out the chemical connection between America's high-fat diet and the formation of cholesterol. If the carbohydrate industries were to recapture this 20% of the calories in the US diet, this change would mean an increase in the per capita consumption of sugar more than a third." The sugar industry's goal was to replace the market share of fat with sugar. So they decided to invest $600,000, which is $5.3 million in today's money, to increase their profits. ATP Science on YouTube does a great job explaining what happened.
They paid $5.3 million to educate policymakers, which are basically politicians with no scientific background, educate policymakers on how fat causes heart disease by basically saying, hey, look inside this artery, it's got fat in it. Look in this food, there's fat. There's no sugar inside this artery. Sugar can't go inside the artery, fat goes in the artery, therefore fat is evil, sugar's good. And the policymakers, make sense to me. I have no idea about science. And with a $5.3 million investment into the propaganda, they managed to get the policy. And what their whole campaign was to stimulate the business associated with the profit of selling sugar by taking 20% of the allocated calories in the food pyramid off the fat to give to sugar.
Profits continued to rise for the sugar industry as people started to eat less and less fat. Everything was going smoothly until new research came out stating that low-fat diets high in sugar could raise serum cholesterol. John Hickson, the vice president of the SRF at the time, began keeping his eye on this new information. He considered multiple ways to combat the so-called deniers, such as physiologist Yudkin. In 1965, the SRF decided to appoint a new member to its Scientific Advisory Board. This new member was Frederick Stare, chair of the School of Public Health Nutrition Department of Harvard University. He was an expert on dietary causes of heart disease and was also consulted by the American Heart Association and National Heart Institute. However, he also had ties to food companies and trade groups, which weren't widely questioned until the 70s. Later on in 1965, a faculty member of Stare's department at Harvard, D. Mark Hegsted, published 3 contradictory studies. The first 2 were epidemiological studies that suggested blood sugar to be a better predictor of atherosclerosis than serum cholesterol. The third study showed that sugar, more than other carbohydrates, contributed to high triglycerides. Yudkin previously claimed that this was a major risk factor for heart disease. The New York Herald Tribune jumped on board, running an article supporting the notion that sugar consumption may be causal in developing heart disease. As Yudkin's hypothesis on the true cause of heart disease gained validation through Hegsted's research, the SRF had to act quickly to protect their financial interests. That's exactly what they did. 2 days after the article was published, the SRF approved of Project 226. Project 226 was designated as a literature review of carbohydrates and cholesterol metabolism. The project was overseen by Stare and written by Hegsted and a colleague at Harvard, Robert McGandy. Hickson provided the researchers with articles demonizing sucrose, which is sugar, that could have potentially threatened his profits. Hickson told Hegsted, "Our particular interest had to do with the part of nutrition in which there are claims that carbohydrates in the form of sucrose make an inordinate contribution to metabolic condition. Until now, the consensus had been that fat intake is the cause. I will be disappointed if this aspect is drowned out in a cascade of review and general interpretation." Hegsted replied, "We are well aware of your particular interest in carbohydrate and will cover this as well as we can." As you can see, Hickson really had a way with words. He converted a man who conducted 3 studies correlating sugar with heart disease to a believer of the dietary fat hypothesis in just a few sentences. Or maybe it was the $6,500, which would be about $50,000 in today's money, that Hickson ended up paying him. Either way, Hickson was one convincing guy. As Hegsted and McGandy worked on Project 226, a separate group of researchers, known as the Iowa Group, were reporting that there were positive associations between the consumption of sugar and serum cholesterol. In the 9th month of the project, Hegsted explained to the SRF that every time the Iowa Group publishes a paper, we have to rework a section in rebuttal. Hegsted gave Hickson the final draft about half a year later, and Hickson assured him, "This is quite what we had in mind, and we look forward to its appearance in print." The literature was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1967 titled Dietary Fats, Carbohydrates, and Atherosclerotic Disease. As with any respectable piece of scientific literature, those who funded the studies were cited in the paper for the public to see. However, Hickson's payment to Hegsted was not disclosed, but that's probably because Hegsted pocketed the cash instead of using it for the research. The paper assured that the only way to prevent heart disease was to reduce dietary cholesterol and to replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats. Any objective view seems to indicate that the SRF retained their own scientific hired guns to manipulate the empirical data and reach their predetermined results. They put out enough information to influence government policy, exactly what the sugar industries needed. The review contained epidemiological, experimental, and mechanistic studies of sugar's effect on coronary heart disease. The epidemiological studies done by Yudkin and the Iowa Group showed that there was a positive association with the consumption of sucrose and heart disease. Of course, those studies were discounted either because of confounding variables, poor interpretation, or the method of collection of the data. The experimental studies showed that serum cholesterol and triglycerides rose when the components of the diet like fat, starch, and vegetables were replaced with sugar. But apparently, the amount of sucrose used in the studies supposedly wasn't comparable to American diets, so that was disregarded by Hegsted and company as well. They also believed that the studies showing a raise in triglycerides were irrelevant because total blood cholesterol was the real risk factor for heart disease.
I don't know about that.
Then finally, the mechanistic studies showed that it was biologically plausible that sucrose could affect cholesterol levels and fructose could affect triglyceride levels. However, this hypothesis was ultimately disregarded because it was built on mechanistic evidence conducted with glucose and fructose instead of sucrose. Never mind that the sucrose molecule immediately breaks down into glucose and fructose upon digestion. Also, never mind that the epidemiology, controlled trials, and mechanistic data all painted a clear picture on sugar's role in heart disease. They also fed rats low-fat, high-carb diets that would supposedly never be in line with the humans, even though that's essentially what they recommended. So the review looked at the overwhelming body of evidence that sugar had a clear role in the development of heart disease, but went ahead and picked each study apart one by one to deny the obvious conclusion. In essence,
they're just making stuff up, okay? All right.
So the SRF-funded review utilized hired guns and dismissed all of the studies showing sucrose to be harmful, but did not include any quantitative results detailing fat's intervention in the studies. Of course, they overstated the effect that fat had in the studies. There was only one randomized controlled trial that lowered serum cholesterol by substituting saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat. Out of all the studies they reviewed, though, this was the only relevant experiment to draw a conclusion with.
Why can't you just look at it?
Yeah, it's sad. It's the only market.
I mean, just look at it.
Even though the epidemiology was ignored with the sugar studies, the epidemiology from the fat studies was extremely important. They could draw the conclusion that fat causes heart disease from those. The review made sure to claim that polyunsaturated fats were a realistic replacement for saturated fats, and that it was the only dietary change that people should make in order to avoid heart disease. It's clear that the SRF engaged in coronary heart disease research in 1965 and then funded and participated in a literature review published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Their role in the review wasn't disclosed until 2016. The New England Journal of Medicine did exactly what the sugar industry wanted them to do and told society to ignore the epidemiological, experimental, and mechanistic studies linking sucrose to coronary heart disease. They told people that the only thing they had to worry about for heart health was dietary cholesterol and saturated fat. Americans had been convinced that they had nothing to worry about when it came to sugar and that they should just avoid fat and they will be fine. So-called healthier, low-fat alternatives started flooding the market with sugar replacing the fat. The story doesn't end there, though.
A few moments later.
In 1971, the sugar industry got into the minds and pockets of the National Institute of Dental Research Caries program. They aimed to shift the focus of dental problems away from the consumption of sucrose. In 1976, the sugar industry came out with another review called Sugar in the Diet of Man. It's credited with strongly influencing the evaluation of the safety of sugar by the FDA in 1976. By the 1980s, most scientists believed that added sugar had nothing to do with coronary heart disease. The SRF got exactly what they wanted, and the money poured in. In essence, whether you know it or not, the sugar industry is a giant money machine. They have had and still have a pivotal role in influencing American dietary policies. Policymakers and average citizens don't read scientific journals, so they will blindly follow the recommendations the USDA gives them. This is why it's so important to regulate conflicts of interest in dietary studies. Some bad information could lead to years of bad policy. Much of the information propagated by the SRF is still very relevant in mainstream science today. With access to insider industry documents like these, we the people have a chance to search for the truth. The SRF paid scientists to come up with enough paperwork to show that sugar is nothing to be concerned about, all to increase their market share. The tobacco industry used similar tactics. They convinced us that smoking was healthy, but thankfully, the public perception changed. Now, even smokers acknowledge that smoking is unhealthy. However, the public perception of sugar still hasn't changed, with most people believing that it's fine to consume in moderation. The sugar industry was more successful in deceiving the public than the tobacco industry because the public still believes them. John Yudkin had worked diligently to research the harmful effects of sugar and let the world know before it became a staple in nearly every food in the market. But as they say, history is decided by the winners. The SRF is now known as the Sugar Association, and it still has a powerful hand in Washington, D.C. It still strongly denies the possibility that there is a relationship between sugar consumption and cardiovascular disease. The sugar industry had a huge role in shaping over 50 years of nutritional science and the dietary recommendations that we still have today. Don't let them fool you. Subscribe to our channel.